Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for coming. We have a nice little program for you this evening. Two wonderful speakers. We'll start with a word of welcome from our director. Then I will give a short explanation of where we stand with the Keiga project screen before we move to our keynote speakers. So, Stijn, if I may invite you.
Dankjewel, Daan. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this public event of the Research Center for Material Culture, the Research Center of the National Museum of World Cultures, which is, as you probably already know, the organization behind Museum Volkenkunde, the Africa Museum, the Tropen Museum, and the World Museum. So welcome. Allow me to extend a very special welcome to our speakers, Dr. Wilson of the University of Mississippi and Dr. Shimada of Tokyo University. Their keynote lectures will undoubtedly shine a new light on the various layers of meaning of the eightfold screen depicting the island of Deshima and Nagasaki, painted by Keiga around 1836. It was a spectacular screen, of course, and you already know it. It was acquired by the museum last year. And since then, the museum has occupied itself intensively with both the research and the restoration. And many of you will be familiar with the restoration efforts for which we held a crowdfunding campaign quite recently. And it's my pleasure to take this opportunity to report here that the crowdfunding was indeed very successful. We've reached our goals, and more than that. And that's thanks to the generous contributions of many enthusiasts. And I've spotted quite a number of them in the audience this evening, that we've reached the goal of, or even surpassed the goal and realized a result of 35,000 euros, which is wonderful. And this is a strong reinforcement of the restoration budget to help the museum to give the screen the best possible restoration. And needless to say, we are very grateful to all who made a donation. Such a restoration is a very intensive and time-consuming process, being carried out by the Conservation Studio Restoriant here in Leiden that is specialized in Japanese works on silk and paper. A wonderful studio with the help from Usami Haru, I hope I pronounced it right, a renowned restorer and mounter of paintings from Kyoto. The restoration and research process was documented in an online blog written by our research associate Davy Verhoeven and our curator for East Asia, Daan Kok. You will find the link to this blog on the Volkenkunde website. And hopefully the blog helps you all to retain your enthusiasm for the screen until the restoration is finally complete, somewhere in the second half of next year, if all goes well. The screen and our restoration also prompts the museum to carry out and to consider a reinstallation of the current permanent display of Japanese and Korean collections. And the screen by Keiga is, of course, a true centerpiece that ties the Japanese collections together. But changing a permanent display is not an easy task. It requires careful consideration, selection of objects, formulation of storylines, and, of course, an appropriate design. And to really come up with a good concept for all of that, we have invited a select group of experts in various disciplines to think together with the exhibition team and curators of the museum about how to achieve a renewed, refreshed, balanced and attractive presentation of the famous Japan collection that we hold with the Keiga folding screen in the center. It's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to these experts, many of them already present here tonight, and wish them a fruitful expert meeting tomorrow. Before we proceed to the main experts, the main speakers of this evening, There will be a brief introduction of the current situation of the folding screen by Daan Kok. You already saw him. And I close by thanking you all for your presence and your attention. And we hope to keep in touch about the whole process, actually, of the restoration of the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stijn. I will be very brief, but I thought this was a nice occasion to give a little bit of background about the screen, about where we stand in the restoration process, and also with regards to the research being carried out currently. Before the museum could acquire the screen, I was already actually busy trying to find out more about the location from where the screen was photographed. And this is a photo I took in 2017, I think, from Tateyama Mountain. And Tateyama is a mountain behind, basically, you could say, the city of Nagasaki, where originally the Nagasaki Bugyo was, so the, I would say, a town hall, city hall, you would now say. This is relatively close to the position that is taken by the painter in the screen. You will understand that the bridge was not there at the time the screen was painted, but it does, I must admit, does save a lot of time if you're trying to get from one shore to the other. When you compare the screen, and I will flick back and forth a few times, you can see that the viewpoint is actually a little bit higher even. And we've received quite a lot of attention from Japanese media, and television stations in Japan have also made drone footage which goes up to the level from where the viewpoint in the screen is actually taken. It's fascinating to realize that Keiga was able to depict such a scene without ever having flown, or at least that's what we presume. In the screen, the largest ship, and quite an impressive ship at the time that you can see, was the Dutch ship Mary and Hillegonda, that we know only sailed to Japan once in 1836. But these days, there are also really impressive large ships, much larger than the Dutch ship of 200 years ago, and you can see one here at the cruise ship terminal to the left. Actually, Deshima is a little bit more to the left in this view, and Keiga has very cleverly shifted Deshima a little bit more to the center, and we think that that was to please the person who commissioned the screen. I mentioned already we have received a lot of attention for it. It has been big news in Nagasaki, and one of the reasons is, of course, that Kawahara Keiga is a son of Nagasaki, you could say. He is very much connected to von Siebold, the collector and doctor who is very famous in Japan. And it is possibly the largest depiction of Nagasaki maybe anywhere. It has actually been on display in its unrestored form for a while in the Kröller-Müller Museum. This may look like the screen is actually really intact, but I will share a secret with you. It only stands upright because it is placed against a dummy screen that is behind it, because it is in such a poor state that it cannot stand on its own. And these are some examples close up where you can see that the silk that has become really brittle over the years is starting to fail, crack here and there, and parts of silk have been lost. This means that the screen needs a full restoration to survive for a little bit longer. A full restoration for Japanese screens traditionally means a full remounting, which means that it has to be dismantled completely. This sounds very daunting as a task, and actually the restorers working on it can probably confirm that it's a very daunting task, but that is what needs to happen. This has one large benefit. it's that we learn so much more about the screen and about when and how it was made. This is a view of the reverse of one of the panels, and you can see that the silk was not only painted on the front, but also on the reverse. That was typical for the Keiga studio, and that was done to make the colors that you see on the front of the silk more solid. So basically, the silk was painted on both sides. A folding screen is mounted on a wooden lattice that is then layered with different layers of paper, and that is also something that has become clear during the dismantling, that actually a lot of reused paper was applied to get the right number of layers before the painting went on. This is actually the back of one of the panels. The fourth slide here shows the original Japanese paper, decorative paper, that was decorating the rear of the screen. But later, most likely in the Netherlands, somewhere in the 1870s or 1880s, a layer of European wallpaper was pasted over the back of the screen. So this is one example. In other parts, in other panels, you can see different layerings and also different papers inside. One of these papers I want to highlight because it's a very typical pattern, and that pattern also can be found in the model houses that we have in the collection, showing models of Decima, as you see one here to the right. And this is on the right is a photo of the inside of one of the rooms in these model houses, which has the similar shippo, as it's called, pattern of wallpaper. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the wallpaper in the screen comes from houses in Decima. That would be lovely, but I have no proof for that. But this is something that we are looking into. The papers that have writing on them have been studied in part by Professor Harada from Nagasaki, who has determined already that many of the papers can only have come from Nagasaki because they mention a festival that is held in Nagasaki. And this, to me, is probably the most exciting slide, although I will understand if you think it's a rather boring slide. But this shows papers that are related to the Chinese settlement in Nagasaki, mentioning the names of Chinese captains who sailed to Nagasaki and mentioning basically shopping lists of provisions that the Chinese bought and brought back to their settlement. And Decima is, of course, very prominently depicted in the center of the screen, but actually the Chinese settlement is also quite clearly visible to the left in the screen, and actually in the bay you can also see 2 Chinese ships at anchor. Nagasaki was a very international port, especially within Japan, and this, I think, is a good bridge to move on to our first speaker of this evening, Dr. Shimada Ryuto from Tokyo University, who is a specialist in inter-Asian trade, and I'm very eager to hear what his thoughts are on the screen and his ideas about how this fits into intra-Asian trade and the location of Nagasaki within that. The floor is yours, Professor Yamada.
Oh, okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for invitation. It is my great pleasure to be here and to talk about some research. Yeah. Now, today I would like to talk about trading aspect. I mean, my major is international trade of Japan and Asia. So yes, actually yes, this is my presentation structure. Firstly, yes, I will talk about the foreign residents district. Yes, I will talk about the, how to say, human interaction, and then yes, trade. Yes, the second section is about the Dutch trade and Chinese trade, and fourth is trading items, and then I will make some conclusions. Yes, first section is about the foreign resident district. Yes, this is yes very how to say amazing and fantastic and very big screen. Yes, actually yes, I looked at this folding screen just before this how to say this time. It's very amazing, and yes, I will focus on these points. One is yes. Hello. One is this is Dutch district, and this is Chinese district. This is warehouse, and this is Chinese residential houses. And also in the part of trading section, yes, I will talk about the Dutch trade. This is Dutch ships, and this is Chinese junks. Yeah. This is Dejima Island. Yes, and it is a residential houses and warehouse of Dutch merchants. And nowadays, yes, the buildings were already yes rebuilt. Yes, and this is it's a sort of how to say entertainment park. Yeah. Yeah. And rebuilt yes houses, and yes this is dining room, and I think yes the entrance fee is very cheap. I mean yes, it's about 4 euros. So please come to here, yeah, when you visit Nagasaki. And then yes, yes, it's some information about Dejima Island. Yes, this is of course yes it was an artificial island. And firstly, yes, it was used for Portuguese. And then, yes, Dutch East India Company used this island as a trading post in Nagasaki from 1641 to 1859. And it was leased. So, yes, Dutch East India Company had to pay annual rent. Yes, it is very expensive. It cost about $1 million US per year. And yes, this island had residential houses, warehouses, and garden. And point is how to say, Japanese authorities, the Japanese authorities strictly restricted for Dutch people to go to outside. Yes, so yes, it's a sort of jail for Dutch people. And also, yes, Japanese people could not enter the island except for some official purpose. Yeah, for example, yes, interpreters could enter the island, and also yes, Japanese prostitute could enter the island. And also yes, I would like to emphasize that yes, there were a lot of many Indonesian slaves. I will show yes, some pictures. Yes, this is a picture held by Nagasaki Museum of History and Culture. And also, I think, yes, some Dutch museum have this kind of scroll. But yes, this is, how to say, a daily life in Dejima Island. And yes, this is dining room, yeah. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 Dutch merchants are eating, and 2 Japanese prostitutes. And yes, you can see he is a Indonesian slave. Yes, and this is a billiard game room, and 3 Dutch merchants and 2 prostitutes and 1 Indonesian slave. Next one. Yes. So now, yes, I would like to talk about the Indonesian slave. Yeah, you will see. Yes, he is Indonesian slave, and Dutch merchant and Japanese prostitute, and yes, baby, maybe father must be Dutch merchant. So yes, yeah, she's prostitute, but she was a sort of, yes, concubine. And this is origin of slaves at Dejima in Nagasaki. Yes, it's yes, in the case of late 18th centuries. These slaves, Indonesian slaves, privately possessed by the Dutch employees. So that was how to say private slaves. And yes, the number of slaves were how to say more than a European merchant in Dejima. Actually, yes, about 20 or 30 Indonesian slaves were there. And on the other hand, yes, Dutch merchant accounted for only 10 or 15 people. And but number is quite, how to say, it's the number of the slaves. It's quite depends on the head of the Dutch trading post. Yes, Opperhoofd. Yes, some rich Opperhoofd had a lot of slaves, and some not so rich Opperhoofd accompanied very few numbers of slaves from Batavia. And this is origins of Indonesian slaves, Asian slaves. Yeah, but Batavia's origin is 13%, and Bugis about 22%, and Makassarians is about 7%, Bali and Sumbawa, Malacca, Kedah, yes, there, yes, Malaysia and Thailand, and some slaves from Indian subcontinent, but very few. So majority is currently Indonesian people. Yeah. And except for Bali's slaves, yes, they were Muslim. So on there were Muslim slaves and also yes Dutch Christians on that tiny island of Dejima in the early modern period. And yes, next one. Yeah, this is a task of Indonesian slaves. Repair of small boat before the arrival of Dutch vessel from Batavia, temporary repair of the houses at Dejima after the typhoon, smuggling. Yes, smuggling is not so task, but yes, some slaves were engaged in the smuggling between slaves and Japanese coolies. And yes, the punishing. Yes, sometimes yes. In the case of smuggling, yes, and Dutch. Yes, Dutch also could punish Asian slave under the Dutch control. On the other hand, yes, Japanese coolies were punished by Japanese authorities. That is the system of the punishment in the port of Nagasaki. And some Asian slaves could play a music instrument. And slaves spoke Malay, and Dutch employees spoke Malay in order to communicate with slaves. And this, I will show the daily life of the Indonesian slave now. Yeah, actually, yes, you can see Indonesian slave, and also, yes, gardening. And next one is playing trumpet, and cello, violin, and harp. And also, yes, they are enjoying badminton on the island. And you can see, yes, every people are male, but some exceptional cases happened in early 19th century. Yeah, three foreign female arrived at port of Nagasaki. Yeah, that is a case of yes, as a family of Kok-Bronhof, and she was yes, wife of Kok-Bronhof, and nanny is Dutch nanny, and yes, baby is male baby, and Indonesian slave, female slave. But it was quite problematic things for Japanese side. Yeah, because foreign females coming to Nagasaki was prohibited. So yes, Japanese authorities were quite serious. It was a serious problem for Japanese side, and so females had to go back to Batavia directly. Actually, yes, but they stayed for 4 months. Because Dutch ships coming from Batavia to Japan in summer season by using monsoon wind. And then, yes, Dutch ships went to go back to Batavia in winter season. So, yes, and so between, yes, summer and winter, yes, 4 months is available. So these people, yes, stayed at Nagasaki for 4 months. And yes, so there are a lot of Japanese painting to depict foreign females. Yeah, because very, how to say, surprising or curious or how to say, amazing things for Japanese people at that time. Now it's on the Chinese district. Yes, this is following maps. Yes, this is Chinese residential houses. And this is from another sources. Yes, actually, yes, it was walled district. Yes, some buildings are still remaining. Yeah, this is how to say Mazu Shrine. Mazu is Chinese female god for maritime affairs, and it was used from late 17th century to the mid 19th century. The purpose of the establishment of this building was to prevent the smuggling. After surrenders of the Zheng family in Taiwan to Qing China in 1683, a Chinese overseas trade was opened, and too many Chinese junks came to Nagasaki. And then, yes, the Japanese authority began the restriction of Chinese trade. So to prevent smuggling, yes, Chinese had to stay in walled district. And also, this is, yes, Chinese warehouses. And yes, it's also, yes, an artificial island, yes, built in early 18th century. And the purpose of establishment of this island was also to prevent smuggling. It was quite easy to control the trade, because there are only 2 bridges. And nowadays, this area is Chinatown, so there are a lot of Chinese shops and Chinese restaurants now. And some Japanese scholars emphasize that, yes, how to say, it was a kind of a leisure business for Japanese side. There, a lot of Chinese merchants came to Nagasaki, and they spent a lot of money for leisure purpose. Actually, yes, you can see, yes, it's how to say, yes, they are eating something, eating and drinking, yes, with Japanese prostitutes. And Chinese merchants, yes, individually spent a lot of money. So for Japanese side, yes, it's a sort of entertainment business. Yes, some Japanese scholars say. Yeah. And also, yes, yes, some other Asian traders came to Nagasaki. This is a ship from Ayutthaya in Thailand. Yeah. Actually, yes, so Vietnamese and Thai and Persian trader also came to Nagasaki, especially in the 17th century. This is a case of junks from Ayutthaya. And so, yes, there are a lot of, there are some interpreters, yes, to speak Vietnamese and Thai or Persian, and in Nagasaki. And this is a textbook for, yes, textbook for interpreters, yes. Yakushi Chotanwa, yes, this is how to say, learning textbook to learn Persian or Vietnamese and Thai, and also Chinese. Now it's the second section about Dutch trade. Yes, Dutch East India Company was engaged in the 2 types of trade. One type of trade is how to say, Euro-Asian trade. The other is intra-Asian trade. And the first type of trade, of Euro-Asian trade, how to say, it was an initial purpose to establish the East India Company. Yeah. Actually, yes, the Dutch East India Company exported silver from Europe to Asia, and the company bought a lot of Asian products for European market. So this is the initial type of international trade. And this is the other very special trade, that is intra-Asian trade. Yeah. In order to save silver export from Europe, yes, firstly, European silver was invested in the intra-Asian trade. Then the profits were used for buying Asian products for European market. And my point is that, yes, only the VOC could establish the perfect combination of the Euro-Asian trade and intra-Asian trade. So, I mean, British East India Company or French East India Company could not do so. Actually, yes, Dutch East India Company had a lot of trading posts in Maritime Asia. Yeah. This is a case study of the year, beginning of the 18th century. Yeah, the Dutch company had 64 trading posts in Asia. So there are a lot of trading posts, and the company used this network scattered in Maritime Asia. And then, yes, Dutch East India Company was engaged in the intra-Asian trade and got a lot of profits. One of the most important intra-Asian trade was this triangular trade between Japan, India, and Thailand. Yeah, actually, Japan exported gold, silver, and copper to India, and India exported cotton textile to Southeast Asia, especially to Thailand. And Siam exported, yes, to Japan, deer hides and lay skin and sappan wood. Yes, this is very, geographically very big and triangular trade, and also it is quite key trade in terms of making profit. But after the VOC, yes, we are talking about, I have to talk about the 19th century case. Yeah. From the late 18th century to the early 19th century, the Dutch lost trading posts in the Indian Oceans. The triangular trade became impossible anymore. The Japan trade became under the control of the Dutch colonial authorities in Batavia. Japanese copper, which was a major exporting item from Japan, was used for minting copper dyed coins at Batavia. These dyed coins were necessary item for Dutch colonial authority at Batavia to control the Java's economy on the local level. And on the other hand, yes, Japanese sugar was imported into Japan on a large scale. And generally speaking, Dutch trade with Japan was declining in the first half of the 19th century, unfortunately. So now is the case of Chinese trade. Yeah. From the 18th century onwards, yes, these trading items were traded between China and Japan. Japan exported copper and also, yes, dried fishery products like sea cucumber, abalone, and shark's fin. It's very unique fishery products. Yeah. But Chinese people like this. Chinese people love this kind of food. And Japan imported these items. Yes, the most important thing is Chinese sugar and also sappan wood from Thailand. Yes, sappan wood firstly is sent to mainland China, and it was re-exported to Japan. And also, yes, important things is silver and gold. Yes, from the mid-18th century, Japan began to import silver and gold into Japan. And yes, it is about a port of embarkation of Chinese junks. In the 17th century, yes, ports of embarkation are quite a lot. Yes, some junks from Taiwan, and some from Southeast Asia, and some from several ports in Yangtze Delta, and also from Amoy. So in the 17th century, there are a lot of ports of embarkation for Japanese trade at Nagasaki. But after the early 18th century, something changed. Yeah, only from the several ports in Yangtze Delta or Amoy's, yes, Chinese junks only came from several ports in Yangtze Delta and Amoy, like here. And this map, this graph shows how to say annual number of Dutch vessels and Chinese junks calling at Nagasaki in the first half of the 19th century. This is the number of Chinese junks, yes, slightly, I think, yes, slightly declining. And this is annual number of calling of Dutch ships, yes, 1 or 2 ships per year. But you can see if from a long-term perspective, yes, this early or yes, first half of the 19th century is quite, how to say, declining or not so important period in terms of volume of trade. 17th century is very, how to say, busy century and declining throughout the 18th century, and yes, the volume of international trade at Nagasaki was very, very small in the first half of the 19th century. And this is a case study of the year 1836. Yes, in this year, yes, that folding screen was made in this year. Yeah, actually, in this year, totally 7 junks came to Nagasaki, and this is original ports in mainland China. Yes, 4 from Nanjing, and 2 from Ningbo, and 1 from Amoy. So only, yes, Chinese junks came from this port town to Nagasaki. And yes, now I have 8 minutes, so I will talk about the trading item. Yes, this is a picture on Dejima, yes, weighing the commodities. Yes, this is Japanese copper for export trade, and this is sugar from Java, and this is sappan wood from Thailand. Yeah, so I will talk about these 3 commodities: copper, sugar, and sappan wood. Yes, this is Japanese bar copper. Yes, Japanese bar copper. Actually, it is the topic of my PhD dissertation. Yes, I got a PhD from Leiden University, but it was more than 10 years ago. But yes, I worked on these items. And yeah, this is yes, annual export of Japanese copper to the Dutch East India companies. Yeah, this is total export from Nagasaki, and this is a annual sale in European market. So European sales in European market was quite small. So major market for Japanese copper was Asia, and especially India. This graph shows yes, Japanese copper sale in Asian waters. And yes, Bengal, Ceylon, Coromandel, and Malabar, Gujarat. Yes, they were quite important market for Japanese copper. And then, yes, also, yes, there are a lot of copper mines in Japan. Yes, the famous copper mine is Beshi. Yes, and maybe some of you know the Sumitomo Group or Sumitomo Bank or Sumitomo Trading Company, and yeah, actually Sumitomo family got accumulated a lot of profit and money, yes, thanks to this business of production of copper at Beshi. And the other important area is around here. Yeah, there are a lot of copper mines, and this is the entrance of tunnel of Beshi mine, Beshi copper mine. And this is a picture of copper production. It was published in the early 19th century. Yes, it called Kodo Zuroku. Yes, it is quite amazing pictures, like this. Yeah, this is digging and carrying, and also drainage. And yes, I used the version kept in Waseda University Library, but also I think this museum has also this kind of book. This is from a photo from this museum, but I have never seen this version. And this is very, how to say, lovely model of copper mine. This museum holds this lovely model of copper mine in Japan. Probably it is exhibited in that exhibition room. Yeah.
60 meters away.
Oh, very closed. Yeah, very closed, but now it is closed. But at today's lunchtime, I heard there is one possibility. It is not copper mine, and this is silver mine or sado mine, silver, gold and silver mine. So I picked some photos. Yes, this is a copper mine in Beshi. Yes, this is drainage pump. And this is drainage pump in Sado gold and silver mines. And you can see this is screw, much more high technique, This pump has one screw. So if we check this kind of drainage pump, if it has a screw, it should be a Sado gold mine. And if, without this pump, without screw, it should be a copper mine from Beshi. And this is a case of sugar. This is sugar, Dutch East India Company and Dutch merchant, imported Japanese sugar to Japan. This is the city of Batavia, as you know, and this is city area of Batavia, and this is surrounding area called Omelanden. You can see, this is rice field, so rice field, and also this Zoika field, cane sugar production area. And actually, from in the late 17th century, large-scale production of sugar was begun in the area of Omelanden. And Dutch Eastern Company exported a lot of sugar to Japan. I think there is one expert over there. Maybe you know, you have a lot of knowledge, more than mine. And next one is Thai sappan wood. Thai sappan wood. Actually, sappan wood is a sort of tree, and used as lead dye, and to use some ballast on ship. And the production area was Thailand and Burma or Manila and Java, so it should be Southeast Asia. And Thai sappan wood was the best in quality, according to some Dutch records. And the Dutch East India Company attempted to send Thai sappan wood to Japan as much as possible. First class of sappan wood to Japan, and second class sappan wood to Europe. That is the policy of the Dutch East India Company, according to the Dutch record. And this is sappan wood. And also, Japanese picture, had this guy, carrying sappan wood. And this is annual volume, annual imports of sappan wood engaged by Dutch East India Company. Peak years around here, mid 18th century, Dutch East India Company imported a huge amount of sappan wood to Japan. Actually, in the beginning of the 18th century, Chinese junks from Ayutthaya brought huge amount of sappan wood to Nagasaki. And then, yes, around here, yes, Dutch VOC imported huge amount of sappan wood. And then, yes, Chinese junks, this is, yes, declining, but on the other hand, yes, Chinese junks brought huge amount of Thai sappan wood. So it's a sort of rivalry, yes, between Dutch and Chinese traders in Japanese market for Thai sappan wood. So now it's a conclusion. I have 1 minute, or well, no, but yes. 10 minutes, 30 minutes, no, 40 minutes. Oh, really? I'm very sorry, yes. Okay. Yes, I can read. Yes. Ethnical districts were a common feature in Maritime Asia during the early modern period. Yet, strict control of entrance and outgoing was different from the cases in Southeast Asia and South Asia. I think strict control is a common feature in East Asia in early modern period. And Dutch merchants and Muslim slaves lived together on the tiny island of Desina. And there were geographically division between Dutch and Chinese traders in terms of market. The Dutch was engaged in the trade with India, while the Chinese focused on the mainland Chinese market. India and China were the center of the world economy until the 18th century. However, the beginning of the 19th century, the balance of the world economy was shifting. A detailed study on the trade in the first half of the 19th century may contribute for the study of the shift of balance of the world economy. And in the first half of the 19th century, the international trade at Nagasaki was smaller than those in the two former centuries. However, lots of historical records still remain. Like the folding screen by Kawahara Keiga, these historical records were treasure for present-day historian. And yes, I have many minutes, so I will use some slides of Daan. Actually, yes, this afternoon, yes, I sold folding screen, and Daan shows, oh, this, that screen had this kind of old record. It is quite, how to say, splendid document. I think I have never seen this kind of record. This is, yes, Daan says, it's official document related to Chinese settlement and Chinese ships. And yeah, actually, yes, this record is a sort of daily life levels record. Actually, yes, this record says, yes, I think this is much more interesting. Chinese people, yes, Chinese people who go outside from the Chinese district. 30 people. Actually, yes, in the case of Dutch Dejima, outgoing was quite strictly prohibited. But on the other hand, the Chinese settlement is not so strict, under control. I mean, some Chinese people could go outside, but they had to report. Actually, this record is a sort of record. Yes, 30 people, 30 Chinese residents, went to go outside together with these items. This is some commodities or some, how to say, religious items. And yes, so and this is, yes, a writer of this report. Yes, it's a head, how to say, captain. I mean, it's captain of Chinese junks. So the captain of Chinese junks, how to say, was responsible. Had responsibility to control all the Chinese under him, and yes, so every day, yes, some Chinese went to go outside from the World Chinese district, and captain had to report the number of Chinese and also, yes, accompanied items. I have never seen this kind of record. I think, yes, these Chinese people go outside to go to the Buddhist temple. I think, yes, this is an item for Buddhist temple, Chinese Buddhist temple in Nagasaki. And also this is how to say, it is house utensils, and some foods and dish, or it's very unique, umbrella, and fish, and vegetable, salt, and numbers, but number is no information. But I think, yes, I think, I can't understand, but I think, yes, it is a, how to say, food stuff and other, the other, how to say, house utensil to be accompanied to go back to China. And also it was a report to the Japanese authorities. And also, yes, I have never seen this kind of Japanese record. So screen is quite important, but also, yes, that screen had this kind of old, how to say, Japanese record. So yes, so in that sense, yes, I'm quite interested in that folding screen. Yes, on the one side and on the other side. Yes, very interesting. And yes, actually, yes, I would like to some yes article on this Chinese daily life. Yes, by using these records. This is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shimada. I'm also particularly grateful for proving my point that that was one of the most exciting slides that I had. I was glad that you had the few extra minutes to also address that. Now, let me try and move through to the next presentation. While I mention that might be an interesting addition, that our research associate Davy Verhoeven found the original cargo list of the Maritime Hillegunda, the ship that is on the screen by Keiga. And on the way to Deshima, it's almost completely full with sugar and sappan wood. And on the way from Deshima, it's almost completely full with copper, which is very congruent with your explanation. So now we move on to our next keynote lecture by Dr. Wilson, who's from the University of Mississippi and a specialist on not only the maritime defense of Japan and particularly of Nagasaki, but also working on whaling and especially the interaction between Japanese whalers and whalers coming from outside in the second half of the 19th century. We were very fortunate to welcome Dr. Wilson already early this week, so we could view some whaling-related objects that we have in the collection. But today, no time for whales, I guess. But her presentation will be on defending Dejima, maritime security, and daimyo rivalry in early modern Nagasaki.
To the right. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, guys, last but not least, I realize for most of us, I'm what stands between now and dinner. So perhaps I'll be as lucky as Professor Shimada and finish a bit ahead of time. But before I begin, would anyone like to stand up and take a stretch? I know what it's like to go for 2 hours. I was very happy to get out of my seat and stretch for a moment. Very useful to fight jet lag coming from the east coast of the United States. If anyone would like to, we have a moment for you to kind of stand up. So please go ahead. I would wish for the same from the speaker in front of me if I were in your seat. Well, first of all, I must echo Professor Shimada and give my very warmest thanks to the tremendous hospitality of Daan and the rest of the staff here, also at the University of Leiden Library today, and to everyone who has welcomed me for my first visit ever. And after just 2 days, I'm looking forward to my next visit, hopefully not too far down the road. Each April for the past 10 years, the southern Japanese port of Nagasaki has hosted an annual Tall Ships Festival to commemorate the long-standing Dutch-Japan relationship. Many of the publicity materials for the 2019 event, as you will see here, featured masts with full sail transiting under the Megami Ohashi Bridge. And so this was also the bridge at the centerpiece of the first photograph from the top of Tateyama that Daan shared with us on his opening slide. Anyway, and you can see one of the ships up here in the left-hand corner, well, actually several, just coming underneath the bridge. The Megami Ohashi Bridge is an iconic feature of Nagasaki Bay today in 2019 and has been since its completion in 2005. The bridge, the only one crossing the harbor, as Daan alluded to as well, is named for its origin point at a site known as Megami on the southeast shoreline of the bay. And for those of you who read Japanese, if you look up here, this is pointed out is Megami Oki Kara, the direction from which the ships enter the inner harbor and kind of approach the kind of wharf area of downtown Nagasaki near Dejima. Here, the water space stretches roughly 1,300 meters, creating one of the shortest crossings of the bay. And you can see the kind of placard on the shoreline right at the base of the bridge that talks about its construction. Through a local competition, it was kind of given a pet name, the Venus Wing Bridge, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner. And there it is at night, creating one of the kind of centerpieces of a very famous night view of the city as well, for those of you who have not been. For those of you who have, I'm sure you'll recognize it. In the early 19th century Japan, when the screen we're discussing this week was created, this very site, Megami, hosted one of the most important coastal fortifications for defending the city. And here we see the Megami side of the bridge and the location more or less where that original fort would have been located, right at the base of the entrance. Situated at the water's edge of what was then the territory of Omura domain, so domain being a province adjacent to Nagasaki, the Megami fort was usually manned by samurai troops from two other domains called Fukuoka and Saga, which were located nearby. Thus, this operation, like most other garrisons lining the harbor, embodied an unusual political contradiction. In defending the Tokugawa's most lucrative trading port, armed forces of one warlord occupied the territory of another. This encroachment was not business as usual for these proud Japanese warlords. The firearms, men, and guard boats posted here from a rival domain, however, fulfilled a very important, if singular, defensive role. And so this is an image of the forts. Later in the 19th century, I'm going to outline the origins for the next few minutes. But you can see Megami Fort here, the kind of major, largest guard post of the Tokugawa, and Deshima right here in the center. And so this point was essentially a kind of choke point at the narrowest point, more or less, where the bridge goes over today, and it was a kind of final bastion to stop potentially belligerent vessel if it tried to enter the city wharf and get close to Dejima. These forts were the first line of protection if marauding ships entered the inner harbor at this choke point. Located at the narrowest node of the bay, resident soldiers could attack belligerent sailing vessels where they had the least wind and also the least space to maneuver. These same samurai could also be at Deshima with a quick row if the Dutch needed protection from an aggressor who successfully made it to the city wharf. Thus, little beknownst to many modern tourists in Nagasaki, the location and the naming of this iconic landmark bridge hold important connections to the city's history as one of the most carefully defended harbors of the Tokugawa period. And when looking at the magnificent screen under scrutiny this week, which we just viewed earlier, however, a viewer would have little idea that the Nagasaki depicted was in fact a militarized city. And so today I'll share a brief history of how that came to be and why I consider it important context for understanding the screen under study. And for those who might be new to this topic, I want to start off with 4 little-known facts about Nagasaki in the 1830s. And after setting up this foundation, I'll pose 4 questions to answer as my talk unfolds. So fact number 1, Tokugawa-era Nagasaki was a militarized city. Not only was Nagasaki permanently garrisoned throughout the Tokugawa period with hundreds and sometimes thousands of samurai, 55,000 at the largest point, its defense system was considered so successful that it served as a template, essentially a prototype, for the later fortification of both the Tokugawa capital at Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and also of Hakodate, the international port on the northern island of Hokkaido, which was developed slightly later. And so here we have a schematic of Japan more or less during this period, early 17th century, with Nagasaki here in the south. And again, the system that developed there was later used as a model, more or less, for the defenses of Edo Bay, and later for the southern tip of Hokkaido, then known as Ezo, in the north of Japan. Fact number 2, the most significant fortifications were located on the shoreline. Whereas previously, during the early Tokugawa era or the end of the 1500s, the kind of greatest sense of attack in kind of major urban areas was often from enemies within. At this point, Japan was most concerned about potential aggressors from without. And so the forts were constructed not to protect Nagasaki from domestic attackers who arrived by land, but rather from belligerent foreign ships, which would arrive by sea. Fact number 3, these military installations were manned by samurai, soldiers, more or less, from neighboring domains or provinces in the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. The Tokugawa official in charge of Nagasaki, an individual known usually as the magistrate in English, bugyo in Japanese, did not have soldiers under his direct command. He depended on samurai from surrounding castle towns to man these coastal batteries. And finally, fact number 4, maybe the most interesting for the group at hand. From the early 1700s through the early 1800s, when almost no Western vessels other than the Dutch arrived in Nagasaki, the primary goal of the Nagasaki fortifications was to ensure a secure trading environment for the Dutch. So these facts beg 4 questions whose answers provide important context for understanding the screen. 1, what is the origin of the maritime security system present in early 19th century Nagasaki harbor? 2, how did defense of Deshima and its Dutch residents fit into this larger duty and ultimately become the centerpiece for over a century in the middle of the Tokugawa era? 3, how did guarding the Dutch shape local political rivalries among warlords, these provincial daimyo, and the Nagasaki magistrates? And 4, in conclusion, how does this backstory help us understand why Keiga omitted these garrisons from his screen? So the origins of the Nagasaki defense system. A Japan-led defense of the harbor only emerged when the Tokugawa took control of the city in the early 1600s. They quickly designated Nagasaki city proper as Tokugawa sovereign territory. Soon its security was overseen by the person of the magistrate, who was initially a provincial daimyo from a neighboring province. This arrangement worked well for several decades until the 1630s, when the daimyo lord of Funai province, who was also the Nagasaki magistrate, committed suicide following his financial improprieties in overseeing trade and taxes, as we know often happened. Given this misbehavior, the Tokugawa shogunate stopped assigning daimyo to the post of magistrate. Instead, they began to appoint 2 direct Tokugawa retainers of impressive rank, but only modest retainer bands and even smaller incomes. Now, this previous daimyo of Funai, who committed suicide, would have commanded roughly 2,000 samurai to mobilize in response to a defensive emergency. But these new magistrates, who were a category of samurai called hatamoto, often translated in English as bannermen, only had some 20 to 30 subordinates at their direct command and did not control the soldiers necessary to defend the port. So with the shift in oversight of the city, the security of Nagasaki now hinged on assigning military forces commanded by someone other than the magistrate to defend the harbor. And the 2 domains who became responsible were the neighboring provinces of Fukuoka and Saga. And so I'll return here, and you can see these 2 domains, Saga here kind of right on the perimeter of Nagasaki proper, and Fukuoka a little further away, its capital, castle town at Hakata, which carried on important trade with Korea across the strait here, with Tsushima often as an intermediary. But that is a separate story. Fukuoka and Saga were the 2 provinces selected because of their proximity, a series of hereditary military successes when the Tokugawa came to power, and also their wealth. And they would defend the port for the next 200 years until the fall of the Tokugawa in the 1860s. Now, this defense system was not created to protect against some abstract threat. Initially, its primary goal was specifically guarding against predicted Portuguese attack. The Tokugawa had expelled the Portuguese in 1639, as many of you know, and they anticipated a return, probably belligerent, to reestablish trade. So in 1641, these 2 domains of Fukuoka and Saga began sending soldiers to Nagasaki each year, alternating oversight, a duty which lasted for over 2 centuries longer. And from the inception of this duty through the end of the 17th century, 3 incidents prove that this initial system was successful. The first episode to test this new configuration was the 1647 arrival of the Portuguese to, as expected, request commercial relations. And here's a picture of the defenses. There are many of these scattered throughout archives within Japan and abroad, but particularly in Kyushu. That's contained in a kind of saga library. And as you can see, an interesting point, many of these emergencies and many of the renditions are after the fact, often centuries later, because they were celebrated and heralded as these models of a successful Nagasaki defense. They're not exactly kind of true to the moment. But what we have depicted here are the 2 ships. So a kind of fairly detailed map of Nagasaki proper, including Deshima, which was often not present in these kind of recreations of crisis moments, which were generally more focused on the water and the kind of boats and the kind of soldiers on the shoreline. And then we have this temporary bridge that was built across the bay to prevent the 2 Portuguese vessels from leaving without permission, and then a whole host of samurai guards and guard boats, along with the heraldry of their kind of clan, of their kind of family crest flags flanking the shoreline. In this incident, 10 domains sent a total of 55,000 troops, the largest Nagasaki mobilization of the Tokugawa period. These 2 domains of Saga and Fukuoka sent the largest forces, roughly 11,000 men each, almost half the total amount. The Portuguese would leave peacefully without a shot having been fired. In 2 more incidents before centuries end, these defenses again ensured the peaceful departure of Western ships. In 1673, the British vessel the Return, which had arrived again to negotiate trade, which they were denied, would leave without incident. And several years later, in 1685, the Portuguese tried one last time with a frigate, the Sao Paulo, which had arrived from Macau, ostensibly to repatriate Japanese castaways, but most officials suspected they had a different agenda as well. Both events suggested the Nagasaki show of force, including numbers of men, weapons, and batteries, were sufficient to prevent an attack. So to sum things up, after the first century of Tokugawa rule by 1700, we see 2 important results in the defense of Nagasaki. 1, the system of alternating duty between the two domains of Fukuoka and Saga has solidified. Multiple shoreline batteries have been built, manned, and supplied with weapons at both the inner harbor, in close proximity to the city, and also the outer harbor, moving to the open sea. The two main batteries at the mouth of the inner harbor, which would be celebrated throughout the Tokugawa period, Nishi Domari and Tomachi, which I'll return to again, were in place by the late 1640s, and by the end of the next decade, a series of other batteries, including Megami, at the base of the bridge. The second result, achieved by 1700, was that this system had been tested and had been judged successful and permanent. From the departure of the San Paulo in 1685 until the arrival of the Russians with the famous Rezanov in 1804, a 120-year period, these shore guards increasingly shifted their attention and energies to protecting the Dutch because uninvited Western ships ceased to come. Now, this 200-year-old backstory may seem extraneous for understanding the defensive environment in the 1830s. Yet documents of 19th century defenses frequently reference the origins in the 1640s. And so even this brief sketch allows us to understand the environment of the screen as the most recent chapter in a 2-century-long story. Sorry, I'm trying to look at my stopwatch, which seems to have stopped here, but we'll see if it's still going. Oh, it stopped. Oh, well. Here we go. So moving ahead then from the origins of the system to the place of the defense of Dejima within this larger security responsibility in the harbor. In the background, as I narrate this portion, I'll just put in a kind of iconic image of Japanese guard boats pulling in a Dutch ship, as it often started to lose wind, but it had to kind of navigate a narrow part of the bay. So as Tokugawa concern about foreign attack diminished from the early 1700s, guarding the Dutch traders at Deshima became the centerpiece of Nagasaki maritime security for the next 100+ years. The Deshima population was quite small, as we know from Professor Shimada, with often men numbering in the single digits remaining for the winter season. But the consequences of this modest presence for coastal defense efforts was profound. As we know, the Dutch trading ships generally arrived in late summer due to these favorable trade winds, and barring bad weather or an equipment malfunction, they departed by early October in our calendar, as was mandated by shogunal law. This predictable trading cycle each and every year dictated the schedules of the Fukuoka and Saga daimyo and their men in 3 different areas. It determined the cycles of these warlords' attendance in Edo at the shogun's castle, known as alternate attendants, to show obeisance to the Tokugawa. And these cycles were shortened and reconfigured so that one of these daimyo was always present in his domain. This predictable trading cycle also determined the calendar of troop deployments from these 2 domains to the harbor. As well, it was responsible for the schedule of the on-duty daimyo's 3 annual harbor inspection tours. So although most warlords spent about 12 months in Edo in alternating years to demonstrate their obeisance to the Tokugawa, Fukuoka and Saga daimyo only spent 3 months to allow them to remain in their domains on standby defensive duty most of the year. The off-duty lord departed for his abbreviated tour of Edo in the 10th or 11th month, immediately following the departure of the Dutch vessels for Batavia, and he generally returned to his castle town no later than the 4th month of the following year to accept responsibility as the new kind of on-duty general of defenses in Nagasaki. The Dutch trading season also determined the rhythms of the deployment of these soldiers to the harbor. During the period from the departure of the Dutch merchant vessels in October through the winter, troop strength in Nagasaki was usually at its low point of some 300 to 400 domainal samurai. And this actually fluctuated over this 250-year period, but that was probably an average. This figure would increase to roughly 1,000 men when the trading ships returned in the summer season to ensure the safety of the Tokugawa's unarmed guests. Finally, the Dutch trading season also determined the timing of the on-duty daimyo general's trips to Nagasaki, known as inspection tours, which were usually 3 per year. Barring delays in travel from the Tokugawa capital at Edo, illness, or other unusual circumstances, the first inspection would occur in the 4th month, following this daimyo's return from Edo. This trip would mark the official transfer of security responsibilities from one domain to another, and the beginning of preparations for the Dutch trading season. The second inspection tour characteristically occurred in the 7th month, following the arrival of the Dutch trading ships, and the final trip was made in the 9th or 10th month, timed to coincide with the departure of the Dutch, so that the on-duty lord could personally oversee the loaded vessel's security as it exited the harbor. And so when we think about the kind of time of year of the screen, for example, because the Dutch ship is in port, this is sometime in the summer trading season, likely, and this gets back to this question of reality versus realism. So theoretically, troop numbers would have been at their kind of highest point of the year. Further revealing the centrality of Dutch trade to the defensive calendar, for the majority of the Tokugawa period, alterations of the Nagasaki magistrates, these governors or officials in charge of the city at large, also followed the Dutch trading schedule. The fall replacement for the on-duty magistrate in Nagasaki, the system varied across the period, but often there was 2 men appointed, with one in Nagasaki at a time and the other in Edo, and they would alternate. But the on-duty, the new magistrate would arrive in Edo several days before the departure of the Dutch vessels, with the outgoing magistrate remaining in port until the ships had left, so that both men were present to oversee a safe departure. By the end of the 1700s, the journals of the Dutch trading chiefs at Deshima consistently noted more visits to Deshima per year by these Fukuoka and Saga daimyo, overseeing defense, than by any other warlord in Japan. Dutch merchant officials had long recognized that the economic advantages of residency in Japan far outweighed any security risk. Thus, even after observing that the Japanese weapons in use by the 1800s, often 200 years old, that these firearms could not plausibly protect them from a Western attack, Dutch merchants continued to treat Fukuoka and Saga domains with special hospitality. And the presence of these daimyo and their soldiers in Nagasaki also offered additional avenues to court favor with Tokugawa officials, since in many cases, depending on the time of the era, these daimyo had kind of personal family connections to a variety of officials in Edo Castle. From both Japanese and Dutch sources, we know that daimyo visits to Deshima might include watching a game of billiards, as we saw previously in Professor Shimada's presentation, sampling Dutch confections, listening to the violin, or viewing the harbor from a telescope. At times, these daimyo, in fact, often, we find in the journals of the daimyo themselves and also the Dutch, they would tour the Dutch trading ships. These social calls created an opportunity to entrench these warlord elites as allies of the Dutch. And there's several interesting anecdotes of how the kind of chief trading officials and other Dutchmen in Deshima helped kind of create this, these relationships of reciprocity. But one interesting example comes from the 1700s, when the Saga daimyo at the time asked the Dutch trading chief if he could provide a derrick or a machine to pull, quote, pull heavy objects of a mountain. And so the chief trader at the time, Van Horn, readily agreed, and he immediately asked his carpenter to produce a model in the hope that it would improve his relations with the Saga daimyo. And that's just one of many examples. Courtesy visits to Deshima also allowed these local daimyo to parade their samurai retinues throughout Nagasaki, another means of asserting that the military authority of these men as superior to that of the magistrate and to each other. Early on, the Dutch had recognized that the spectacle of domain defense duty was not primarily an attempt to impress foreign guests. Rather, it was a manifestation of the competition between these daimyo warlords and the magistrate for military authority in the port. And this contest became all the more prominent during an era of extended quietude, when these individuals could not establish their legitimacy through responding to a defensive emergency. And so during a period without the advent of unexpected Western ships, defensive duty prioritized spectacle over efficacy. And so before moving to my consideration of these questions of daimyo rivalry, I wanted to share a few images and kind of explore this notion of pomp and circumstance and the creation of spectacle during times of quietude that appears in a series of images during the arrival of the Russians in 1804 with Admiral Rezanov. And so in this one, for example, they also just offer a few more examples of the character and the variety of the depictions of the harbor, particularly during defensive crises in this period. But especially they represent, most of my work has actually been done in Fukuoka archives, so I think particular characteristics of the documents that remain there. But here you can see, even though this was an emergency and maybe merited the kind of importance of, as many experts in the room know, but the general public may not be aware of spotlighting the heraldry and particularly the family crest of the individuals involved in the response. And here we have the kind of reverse Hinomaru, the national Japanese flag, in the form of the Kuroda flag, but instead the white circle on a red field. And we begin to learn a fair amount about the mechanics of defense as well, and in precisely how many individuals it required, because many of these ships, if you read Japanese, can tell, would identify the number of rowers required to maneuver them, and that is quite interesting. Another one from this period, a different vantage point and a different artist recapturing many decades after the fact, this emergency response. And I think one of the interesting details here that's very different from some documents of the Nabeshima family, the Saga clan that we viewed earlier today, is in the early 19th century the fact that there were almost never weapons depicted in these images. And so the response of the Japanese and the harbor and the kind of visible, I think, presence of military forces had to do with individuals and manpower and numbers of soldiers, and not with the kinds of weapons that were used, which still tended to focus on bladed weapons. And so you can see here, again, the regalia of one of the Fukuoka, the Kuroda clan ships. But when we kind of blow up a portion of this picture to the insert of the coastline, we see the emphasis, again, on the kind of pageantry and the decorations of the site, and not on the kind of fortitude and kind of military power of the weapons that have been installed. And again here, so many of these images that remain in archives today really emphasize, so the same incident, again, a different portrayal, the scale of the pageantry and the number of kind of boats and individuals involved. In this case, this particular image was important to actually a branch clan of the Kuroda house. So we see this kind of daimyo rivalry and sometimes inter-clan competition as well for kind of high-ranking samurai, not necessarily the daimyo, but they often had branch families which were preserved in case of the failure to produce a male heir, for example. And in this case, these are boats of one of the branch clans, Akitsuki, of the Kuroda family. And I think some experts assume that this was created to try to underscore their contributions to these defensive efforts, even though they were often didn't receive the same attention that the daimyo's kind of primary clan members received. And so you can see here, particularly individuals from this branch family are mentioned. I mentioned previously that the Dutch recognized the pomp and circumstance of domain defensive duty was not just pageantry to impress foreign guests, but rather a show of the competition between daimyo, within daimyo families among high-ranking individuals, and between daimyo and magistrates for military authority in the port. These tensions of control erupted dramatically in the infamous Phaeton incident of 1808, when a British frigate disguised as a Dutch trading vessel sailed into Nagasaki harbor and captured 2 Dutchmen during the Napoleonic Wars. Saga and Fukuoka summer reinforcements had left the harbor earlier than expected because no Dutch trading ships had come that year. Their absence, and Saga had only some 50 to 60 men at the battery. Saga domain, the Nabeshima, were the kind of generals in charge that summer, and had only this paltry number of soldiers instead of the expected 400 to 500. And this absence prevented the magistrate from attacking the Phaeton, or so he argued. For decades, these two domains, Fukuoka and Saga, had regularly sent many fewer men to Nagasaki than required. So in the summer season, often this complement of troops, when the Dutch were in port and most in need of security, was barely even 100. However, the magistrate held little power to enforce the official regulations specifying the number of soldiers required. Lamenting his inability to defend the Dutch, the magistrate at the time of the Phaeton incident committed suicide, the only magistrate to kill himself for defense-related matters during the entirety of the Tokugawa period. But he killed himself only after writing a note, or really a manifesto, calling for the reinstatement of the magistrate as a daimyo, so that Nagasaki might be a castle town with its own troops. The absence of Fukuoka and Saga troops in this emergency reflected two structural elements of defense that undermined the magistrate's authority. In addition to the fact they could not plausibly have defended themselves had the Phaeton decided to open fire. And this is a slide I occasionally use when I'm kind of teaching these themes to undergraduates in my university to kind of demonstrate side by side roughly the size of the largest Japanese vessel, which here is out of scale, next to the Phaeton. And you can imagine the disparity in firepower. But these two structural elements exposed in this incident that had persisted from the beginning of the creation of the system were very important for understanding the inability of the magistrate to have greater control of defense in the harbor. And the first of these were the challenges of partitioned sovereignty and local territory on the perimeter of the bay. And we looked at this, some of us this morning, in these new Nabeshima Saga domain documents acquired by the Leiden University Library. And so you can see here that the city proper is Tokugawa lands, but as you move out, these batteries or guard posts on the kind of south side, left side of the harbor, are primarily located in Omura domain, which would send troops to the harbor if there were an emergency, but generally did not have men posted at these garrisons. And so it was quite difficult for daimyo during this period to kind of accept the reality that you had soldiers from a potentially kind of rival or previously rival domain on your lands. And so Saga, at different points, controlled these islands in the bay. And then here on the right side of the harbor, you have some lands with a crosshatch that also belong to Omura, and there would be some lookouts posted here at times as well. And then as you move back towards the city, you have again Tokugawa lands. So while the magistrate was ultimately responsible for defense of the harbor, he did not always control the lands on which the forts were situated, even though he controlled officially the territory that was considered Tokugawa sovereign property. The second element at play here that kind of speaks to the political climate of the moment of the screen and the entirety of the Tokugawa era is the creation and positioning of domainal residences known as yashiki in this period, actually since the late 1600s. And so communications in time of defensive crisis were not in fact coordinated by the magistrate, but rather through a system of domain compounds maintained by the separate daimyo, including Fukuoka and Saga, but also 14 others who were charged with providing troops in time of emergency. So in the case of the Portuguese in 1647, the Phaeton incident, for example, Rezanov's arrival, you would have other domains scattered throughout Kyushu, sending thousands of troops as well. And here are the majority of them marked on this image. And you can see Fukuoka right here and Saga right here, so the two domains in charge. I misspoke previously. These domains were not entirely from Kyushu. We have an outlier here, Choshu domain, which was also charged with potentially sending troops in an emergency. But the point being that these were the kind of primary channels of kind of information sharing and not the magistrate, so it gave him kind of less control that might be expected over the kind of speed and the scale of the troops that would be sent. But I want to point out Fukuoka right here. I think on the screen itself there's a guard boat potentially that is flying Kuroda Fukuoka domain crest, and it makes me curious about how often that happened in close proximity to the domain residence, which was right there on the shoreline. So, my conclusions to wrap up. In spite of the Phaeton incident, few significant improvements occurred to Nagasaki defenses before 1836, the time of our screen. In a diary of a Fukuoka fall inspection in 1835, a daimyo trip to survey the harbor, and this was the year before the screen was created, precedent rather than defensive efficacy dominated in the review of harbor batteries. The garrison inspections by Fukuoka officials in the 10th month that year were cursory, recorded, quote, as following without alteration a route of 1821, instead of planning some special itinerary that might have given particular attention to recently refurbished sites. This replication from 14 years previously suggests that no significant military improvements had occurred in the intervening years. Yet responsibility for the Dutch allowed the domains to continue to serve in Nagasaki with a sense of military purpose during these quiescent periods without the arrival of uninvited foreign ships. As many of us have already observed in casual conversation, the reality of the screen is that it represents not merely the reality of the screen is represented not merely by what is present within it, but also by what is missing. Where, in fact, is the Megami garrison fort and the rest of the seaside installations that were present in Nagasaki Harbor in the 1830s? The glaring omission is not merely that these garrisons and the men stationed there, but also of the guard boats that would have been present in the summer season. The shoreline in the screen is more pristine, and also the water space is less busy with traffic than if the guard posts had been present. This omission minimizes the influence of the Dutch presence on local political dynamics in the 1830s. Their residence in Nagasaki shaped relations among groups of daimyo across the island of Kyushu, as well as among daimyo and the Nagasaki magistrate. As Keiga lived and worked in Nagasaki, he was certainly aware of these considerations. However, while these valences carried great import to Japanese, they were likely of little interest to foreign audiences. Omitting the forts makes Nagasaki not only peaceful and pacific, but also apolitical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. It's absolutely wonderful to see, and it's an extra addition to our understanding of the screen and how the screen looks very realistic, but does not necessarily depict reality, hence our title for this event. Now, I would like to call to the fore both our speakers and our moderator, Jurre Knoest, who is researching smuggling networks in Nagasaki. We have time for questions, about 20 minutes from the room. So if I may ask you to step onto the podium, please. We have some seats for you here. I will give, each of you have your own microphone, and I will take this one into the room and hand it through to questions. Jurre, if I may ask you to organize the questions that we have from the room while I put up the screen, on the screen, once again.
Okay, good evening, everybody. First, I'd like to thank both speakers for a very engaging presentation. And now we've come to the most interesting part of the evening, the interaction with the audience. And I would like to ask the audience if there are any particular questions for Dr. Shimada or Dr. Wilson. Are there any questions for Dr. Shimada at this point? Yes. Okay, who brings the microphone to?
Test. Oh, okay. Thank you very much for holding the mic. Thank you very much for the very interesting and diverse presentation. I would like to ask, what is the reason for the decline of trade between Dutch and Japanese during the 18th century? Is it because of the arrival of the British, or are we merely speculating? Thank you.
If I may repeat the question, what is the reason for the decline in Dutch and Chinese trade during the 18th century? If I'm correct.
Before
The Dutch and Japanese trade, yeah.
I'm thinking now. Okay, yes. Firstly, yes. Japanese, restriction of international trade. Especially Japan began the substitute production. Yeah. Actually, yes, for example, yes, silk or raw silk. Yes, Chinese raw silk is very, very important item in Japan. Yeah. In 17th century, Japan imported a huge amount of raw silk from China. But Japan began to substitute production throughout the 18th century. Yeah. So Japanese demand declined. So for Chinese raw silk, and then yes, international trade of Nagasaki declined. And in terms of Dutch trade, yes, perhaps yes, important things is also yes, Japanese demand declined. Also yes, the VOC gave up the Thai connection. Actually, yes. After the after the collapse of Ayutthaya kingdom of Ayutthaya in 1767 or yeah around there, yes, yeah. It was quite difficult to get Thai products for Dutch East India Company from Ayutthaya to supply Japanese market. On the other hand, Chinese trader yes imported Thai rice to mainland China. So I think yes, Siamese economy was shifted from Japanese side to Chinese side. Yeah, this is my answer.
Okay, thank you. Another question for Dr. Shimada.
Thank you. Since it was mentioned that the moderator is a researcher on smuggling as well, I was fascinated to hear about the slaves, the Indonesian slaves smuggling with coolies, Japanese coolies. Just curious what kind of data we have on it. Did they trade different kinds of things than the Dutch, for example?
Do you mind if I answer this question?
You are a specialist. But yes, after, yes, by using Dutch daily register, and also, yes, we can use, a punishment record of Japanese side. Yeah, but smuggling is not so serious. For example, yes, Indonesian slave took a very small silver spoon and sold it to Japanese coolie. It's very small smuggling.
But if I may add something, it might appear to be very small in size if you compare it to the annual Dutch trade. But actually, if you look at what people make at that time, lower class people, commoners, for them, one bag of pepper or one bag of ginseng can mean a fortune. So even if it's just a tiny bit compared to the overall trade of Japan, the Dutch, and China, this smuggling economy for the fringes of society can actually mean the difference between starving to death and making a living. Are there any more questions for Dr. Shimada at this point? Yes.
Yes, my question to Dr. Wilson. I was wondering, there are many bird's eye views of the Deshima Bay, and is on all those views are the batteries, the defenses of the bay left out? Because I think that one of the typical things of these bird's eye views is that the structure and the positioning of the boats is always the same. There seems to be a fixed iconography, so to speak. And I wonder whether simply, if you were to look at a bird's eye view of 1780, of which there are, a few in Holland, if also these defenses are lacking or not being depicted. I have a feeling that it's very difficult to interpret directly what you see on a screen like this, and you cannot discuss it without discussing the tradition of the iconography of these screens.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think I have art historian colleagues in the room who are probably better prepared to answer that than I am. I mean, I know that in the mid-17th century, when these were newly created, it was kind of an edgy, exciting, kind of fresh, object of curiosity in Nagasaki. So they seem to be included fairly frequently. But in the course over the Tokugawa period, it seems that they maybe were often omitted. And I have to admit that most of my analysis of Nagasaki prints, if you call it that, during this period, are from Fukuoka and some from Saga Domain, and so they were very interested in emphasizing their own military contributions, certainly for an internal audience. And I think that's a great question. It's something that Daan and others may have already looked into, but there are other folks in the room. We might get to this question tomorrow. And if they want to jump in now, I welcome them to add what they know.
Could I suggest one more thing? Could it be that that it was actually censored out of these because of the Tokugawa were very sensitive to all kinds of spying. I mean, it was the niece of Cosimo. But could that be the reason that absolutely no military detail should be visible in the screen?
Well, yeah, I guess I didn't mention it in casual conversation. That seems to be one of the first surface easy speculations. Keiga was banished from Nagasaki for a period, precisely for painting the crest of some of these warlord families on ships in the harbor. So that actually seems the most likely candidate. But I was just kind of brainstorming about the larger I guess, kind of context in which the screen was created. But yeah, I think that's probably true.
Okay, I would like one more question for Dr. Shimada before we move on to Dr. Wilson. Yes.
I have a question, not a question, but a remark for Dr. Wilson, actually. I'm sorry.
First, Dr. Shimada, please. We'll move to Wilson later.
Twice an artificial island was mentioned. How did they make those? From my point of view, that's interesting as a Dutchman.
How did they make Dejima and Tojin Yashiki?
Yeah, Japanese made.
A lot of sand and a lot of stones dumping in the bay.
I don't know.
And then building.
How to establish or build. Yeah, but investor was a Japanese merchant. Yeah, actually, yes. Nagasaki's rich merchant invested a lot of money to build the artificial islands. But I don't know any information on technical affairs. I'm very sorry.
Well, the buildings were largely Japanese. Even the warehouses were Japanese, but plastered with mud. Mm. And they were not allowed to build stone warehouses like they did in Hirado, which had to be broken down. And Yeah, actually the house owners of Dejima were also responsible for their repairs in the 17th century, and this changed when the Dutch became responsible for the repairs in the 18th century. And every other year some building would collapse because of lack of maintenance. And then you had to negotiate with the carpenter to build a whole new structure or not. And of course the rent had to be paid to these investors who built the island for the Portuguese at first. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Are there any questions for Dr. Wilson at this point?
Dr. Wilson, just a remark about the military side of things in these batteries, as you call them. They are batteries, but there are some images of these batteries with military equipment in it, but the military equipment in Japanese military development was stagnant, almost non-existent. So they didn't have anything to show on these pictures, I believe. They were very well aware of their lack of knowledge, and from the end of the 18th century onwards, and started talking actually to the Dutch at Dejima to get technical information about how to make artillery, which they succeeded in the 1830s, started doing that and produced in the 1840s and 50s some artillery, but was not sufficient to really defend against these European ships at all. So that's one of the reasons I think that there's no military equipment showing.
Yeah, excellent point. I mean, often some of the records from this period, still these domains will kind of inventory the number of guns and the kind of gunpowder storehouses and this thing, which has just become convention by this period, but I think it was a bit self-congratulatory. I mean, it hadn't been tested, and occasionally their men would die when they would have kind of practice days to go and dust the cobwebs off in case they wanted to try to use them. But yeah, definitely point well taken. But for internal consumption, I mean, it's always an interesting question to speculate who was meant to be the viewership for some of these pieces that kind of emphasize their martial prowess when there were no weapons involved at all. And I think there were lots of internal viewers who would have had no idea about this technology gap. But yes, I think what you've said is very true.
Okay. Are there any more questions for Dr. Wilson at this point? No, then I have a question for Dr. Wilson. You mentioned that Dejima became the leading force for these military activities, these guard duties of these daimyo. But what about their other duties for policing the harbor bay to prevent Chinese smugglers to connect with their Japanese counterparts? I can imagine that had to be all year round because Chinese ships would arrive at any point. So wouldn't that make the bay also swarming with ships?
Well, my understanding of things, but in most periods, I mean, this could vary from decade to decade, that it was actually the magistrates, officials, and kind of city employees, so to speak, who were manning and operating these kind of smuggling reconnaissance boats, and not those of the samurai from the domains who were posted at these coastal forts. I know you've done all this work on smuggling. Maybe you have documents that say to the contrary.
Well, sometimes you can read that these smugglers were apprehended at certain guard posts. So, or people trying to swim to Chinese ships in the Bay Area or near the guard posts. So, yeah, I was wondering if you haven't found anything in the Fukuoka and Saga archives that talk about these police missions.
I haven't. It's been a while since I've been digging around, but I guess at the time that wasn't my primary goal, though, I do discover that in the late 1600s and other 1700s, when the magistrate in Nagasaki, who seemed to have a fairly effective iron fist on smuggling at different periods, clamped down, and so a bunch of these folks actually went to what's known as the Genkai Sea, and so it's this kind of inland body of water right off the Fukuoka castle town called Hakata, actually moving all the way up to the tip of the main island of Honshu and the Choshu area, and there was a province called Kokura in the middle. And so these samurai who'd been kind of sent to Nagasaki to potentially ward off some Western ship are kind of twiddling their thumbs with nothing to do. And so many of them were reassigned to this coast when the smugglers had moved northward. So I have to say the most work that I've done on these guard ships being used to counteract illicit trade are more off the shore, kind of facing Tsushima and Korea, and less in Nagasaki Harbor.
Thank you. Then one last time, we have time for one or two more questions to either of the speakers. Yes, in front, please.
Thank you very much for fascinating papers. Listening to your two papers trigger more and more interest in the painting we are seeing in front of the screen. Actually, so my question goes to either two of the speakers, or maybe Dan could answer. But I don't know at this moment who could answer, but the question is, at this moment, to what extent do you have any clues about the period of the painted period? So the creation year is circa 1836, but as we learned in our previous discussion, that the depicted or illustrated period or scene can be different from the actual creation year, and we also have seen that there are some records on the backside, and so I was wondering to what extent you have discussed the creation year, and also I would like to know more about the provenance research, because it's quite interesting that it has been on view on the Crater Muller before. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I guess it's a little bit up to me to make some remarks, but I have to say we've not only been discussing the year, we've been discussing the moment in the year, and we've been already discussing the time of day. Now, we know that this ship arrived in, what was it, July, end of June? Early July of 1836. The ship is by far the most detailed item in the depiction, in the painting. We have the original drawings used for building the ship because it was built just 1 year before it sailed to Japan. And we know that the number of windows on the stem, we know that the distinctive shape of the bow, and we know that the number of attachment points for the rigging of the masts are congruent with the original building drawing. So it's very precise. It's extremely precise. The flags in the masts have numbers in them that are consistent with the captain's number of the captain that sailed on this ship to Japan. So the ship is very central to the whole composition. It's the most precise item, and we know exactly when it was in Japan. We know that the ship, I'll try to keep it brief. We know that the ship was copper-clad, which means that the part underneath the water had plates, copper plates on it. This was done to prevent barnacles and mussels, etc., to attach to the hull because it would slow the ship down. And the oxidation of the copper prevents that. It also makes the ship sail more smoothly. If you look at a close-up of the ship, you can see that even that part is faithfully depicted.
So do you think Keiga had a chance to actually look at the ship, or did he have
Yes, he must have absolutely had a very, very good look at the ship. So we were discussing that we know that it would be filled with a lot of heavy copper and other materials taken from Japan and brought to Batavia. And we think that that cargo is not yet on the ship, because you can still see the copper-clad part that is normally below the waterline. So we think the ship is a little bit high in the water. We also know from the shades that the shades in all the figures, that the sun must come from this direction. And since we're looking more or less to the south, we know that that is the morning sun. So it's the shades are in this direction. So it must be somewhere 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the morning. So we know this must be a moment in the second half of 1836. It must be after July when the ship arrived, and it must be before, what was it, end of October, I think? It left a little bit late. Yeah. And it is before, it's probably after the cargo was taken off the ship and before the new cargo was put on the ship. So that, I guess that narrows it down to about September. Nice early sunny morning in September. Please excuse my lengthy answer, but I hope that is a reply.
Okay, thank you. I believe it is time, yeah. So I'd like to...
Do we don't want
one more question?
I don't want to be the last one to give an answer.
If you can have the microphone in front, please.
I have a very small question about, perhaps also for Dr. Shimada and for Daan, indeed about the fascinating backing of the Chinese information on the Chinese factory. It is apparently a very unique document because there are none left in Japan, but then why would it be on a Dutch screen, a screen meant for Dutch? Does this mean that the Dutch were spying on the Chinese in some way, or acquiring information on their trade and how they live their lives? Or is there anything known about that?
Well, yeah,
What
I
would it
have
mean
an
that it-
idea about this. Well, my speculation is that the kind of document that we saw inside the screen is typically a document that is not considered to be really important. So it's something that you would discard anyway. And as such, it is used as old paper to fill up the screen, I think.
But why would it be in the Dutch possession?
Well, it was a paper that was available at the time when they made the screen. So, I think.
No, it's an excellent question, and it's a question that remains to be answered. The Chinese documents that came out of the screen are relatively a recent discovery, and I think we will do a lot of speculation about the whereabouts, but my assumption right now would be that when the painting was made, it was sent to a mounter, which is a separate profession, and the mounter would have used everything that is available. And it's quite clear from different panels, everything that was left over was used to fill the screen. So we have a variety of documents. I was actually quite surprised to also find Chinese documents, but I think there is no relation to the Dutch. I think it's just it's an assignment to the mounter to mount the screen, and where the mounting studio gets their paper. I mean, it's actually known that some people who wanted to have a painting mounted would have to bring their own old paper as materials for use in the screen. The paper was very expensive, so this is all recycling. And that's also why the papers date to about 4 to 15 years before the screen. So the dates we have found so far all fall in that bracket.
Thank you. Now you're still the last one to answer the question. So.
Sorry, I fell for the same trap. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jutta, for moderating the Q&A panel. Thank you very much, Dr. Shimada. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson, for some very enlightening panels. I think it has greatly increased our knowledge and understanding of the screen, and I think it's a great stepping stone also in the process of finding out more and understanding better not only the outside of the screen, but also the inside. So I'm extremely grateful for your wonderful talks. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for all who attended and asked very interesting questions. Those will also help us to carry out our further research into the screen, and we hope to keep you updated through our online blog that we have already mentioned. And of course, when the screen is completely restored, you will all be informed, and I really hope to see you again at the unveiling then and there. Thank you very much.